Really quick heads up before we begin, this video was supposed to come out last week, so no, it is not in fact about the new Spider-Man 2 game, though don't worry if you want to hear my thoughts on it, I'm absolutely going to work on a longer review, but because I'm behind schedule, it's probably not going to be out this week. Instead, this video is just reminiscing about all the good superhero games we got over the last 20 years, and of course talking about the decline from around 2016 to now. And as it turns out, Spider-Man 2 turned out to be yet another Sony cinematic slop game full of woke propaganda. So hopefully this will tide you over until the review is done. Now on to the video. Remember when superhero games were good? These days, it's incredibly easy to make fun of comic book fans, especially since it became the normie thing to enjoy superheroes ever since the explosive popularity of the MCU and the general push to make geek culture socially acceptable to the average person instead of something that you would bully someone for liking. I'm not sure if I've said this before on this channel, in case I haven't. When I was going through high school is right around when video games became mainstream. I remember around 9th grade, everyone started talking about Call of Duty and Assassin's Creed, people who I'd never heard mentioning video games before. And the same exact thing happened to superheroes, again, when the MCU started getting popular. And so you would think after making billions of dollars, having this massive new genre take off, with copycats nowhere near the level of quality, no matter what DC fanboys might tell you, you would think we would have gotten a lot of really good video games around this time. But no, ironically, most of the greatest superhero games came out before the first Avengers movie even released in theaters. Now, in retrospect, this actually makes perfect sense, because back then, the developers making superhero games genuinely cared about the property and doing it justice. Even movie tie-in games were higher quality back in the PS2 time than the PS3, and by the time the PS4 rolled around, all this tie-in shovelware was basically dead anyway, and so we got even fewer superhero games. Now, despite what some of you might think of me, especially my haters, I do not think that every game that came out PS1, PS2 era was a hidden gem masterpiece and it was completely flawless back then. No, there was plenty of shovelware trash. But when I say older games are better, I'm never judging it by the worst games that release, I'm judging it by the best. And higher budget products were simply better 20 years ago. Let's talk about some of those great superhero games. Despite most of my videos having a negative slant, this one's gonna have a bit of positive and a bit of negative. Despite my retro reviews not doing so well views-wise, sometimes I do like to talk about older games, and as I've mentioned a few times on my channel in the past, sometimes I'll play a game I've never played before that released back in that era, and what do you know, I enjoy myself more than I do almost any modern release. The best example of this is a game I just played, and the reason I made this video, as you could probably guess, Spider-Man 2. Growing up, I never owned this game. I only ever played it at a dentist office. Yes, I don't know if kids' dental offices still do this, but they used to have consoles encased in these big plastic things, and then you could play from whatever game they currently had inserted in the PS2, or sometimes they would have a variety of demos to choose from, kind of like store kiosks. And that was the only time I ever got to play Spider-Man 2. So, as I finally sat down and played all the way through it on stream, I'll be honest, I love the game. It's a great game. It's not flawless, certainly. Actually, it has a lot of flaws, but the important thing is the game emphasized fun before anything else. Now, is fun a buzz term and completely subjective? Yeah, kinda. Obviously, what I enjoy is not what everyone else is going to enjoy in video games, but there certainly was a different design philosophy of older games that they don't really do anymore, which is prioritizing that the main gameplay loop is as fun as possible before doing anything else. Spider-Man 2 is a perfect example of this because just playing the game feels so satisfying, better than any movie tie-in game should ever feel. You've probably already seen a dozen channels by now talk about how good the web swinging is in that game, and yeah, I can attest to the fact that it's aged perfectly. It is absolutely better than the web swinging in Insomniac Spider-Man. It just is. The physics feel perfect, the sense of momentum, the skill. It actually takes skill to not swing into buildings in Spider-Man 2. You get used to it, but there's something about that flow, trying to keep up the maximum speed possible, that kind of reminds me of Sonic games, and I like Sonic. You know, I'm one of those people. I'm not going to pretend the games are amazing, but I like 3D Sonic games. I reviewed Adventure 1 and 2, and I'll defend those games to death despite their many flaws, and Spider-Man 2 reminded me of that. Even the combat had a surprising amount of complexity to it. There were way more combat moves than a 6-hour game ever should have. This game was made with replayability in mind, which is something that no modern game is made for. They don't give a shit if you play it over again from the beginning, because they know 90% of players will never do that. Almost every aspect of modern games is designed with the lowest common denominator player in mind, aka DSP. And so while you could certainly make the argument that the web swinging has more moves and is more complex in Insomniac Spider-Man, and the combat is a lot less jank, and so you can more reliably get better at the game. It has that sort of like Arkham style combat where people get very perfectionist about it. I could certainly see people saying that the 2018 Spider-Man is a better game than Spider-Man 2, but again, that nebulous sense of fun is far more important than any of that shit. And something that people may not realize is at the time, it was so easy for a movie tie-in game to just cover the plot of the film and add in some gimmicky mini-games and call it a day. Well, Spider-Man 2 very naturally incorporated Mysterio, Shocker, and Black Cat into the game, and it feels like it totally would have belonged in the movie. And Tobey Maguire actually reprises his role as Spider-Man, though his voice acting certainly needed work.
Hey, it's Mysterio, the cliché who walks like a man.
So you could really feel the love was poured into this game. It might just be the greatest movie tie-in game of all time. But Spider-Man 2 was far from the only good superhero game that released back in the PS2 era. A good example is Hulk Ultimate Destruction, another game that I just played before making this video. For those of you who've played Prototype, this game will actually feel fairly similar, as it was made by the same developers. And this was probably one of the first superhero sandbox games that just let you go crazy on a city. While in Spider-Man 2 you could pile drive people off of rooftops and snap their necks. Yes! Yes! Oh my god! How is she alive? Oh my, and that taxi just ran her over. She's dead. So much for Spider-Man never killing anybody. Hulk Ultimate Destruction actually lets you straight up kill civilians by punching them or throwing them off of rooftops. This is definitely one of the first in the, what I'm going to call, power fantasy superhero games. Essentially, the sandbox games where you're blatantly overpowered and you just wreak havoc on a city, right? To name a few other examples, obviously Prototype, Crackdown, Saints Row 4, all of those games essentially follow the same formula that came from this. And they're fun as hell. I don't know why these don't exist anymore. They're really fun games. Now, there is a reason why people don't really talk about Hulk Ultimate Destruction, but to this day, we still bring up Prototype or Crackdown. Because this game is arguably the first in this subgenre, it is extremely rough around the edges. It feels a little unfinished, definitely low budget. The mission design is horrific. Hulk feels weirdly underpowered in certain missions, or just really helicopters and SAM batteries are OP as fuck. When you have 8 homing missiles chasing after you and just juggle you to death, well, you don't really feel like one of the most powerful characters in the Marvel Universe. No, you feel like a bitch. The military bends Hulk over and he takes it in certain missions in this game. It is incredibly frustrating. That being said, this is probably the closest game, and forgive me for sounding like a game journalist here, that makes you really feel like the Incredible Hulk. Picking up cars, molding them to your fists, smashing tanks, throwing boulders at helicopters. For how simple the game is, it's still pretty fun, but I would definitely recommend Prototype over this, as it's pretty much everything Hulk Ultimate Destruction is, but better. Now let's talk about the Punisher game. If you know me, you know I'm an edgelord, so I enjoyed the shit out of this, despite it being kind of a mediocre game, all things considered. This was made by Volition before they made Saints Row, and so the shooting is incredibly basic and mostly unsatisfying and repetitive. And so why should you play this game? Well, for one reason, and that is the numerous special executions. Now, unfortunately, you're going to have to play the PC version if you want to see these in their full glory, because this game was actually censored before it was released, otherwise it would have received an adult-only rating, but a simple patch can restore these executions on PC. And honestly, there's no point in even describing them. I'm just going to show you my reaction to several of them in-game. Some broken enemies can be released. Press E and E again to release them. I have a better idea. Yeah! Die! Die! Oh shit. Fuck. I did on accident. In the sense... no, I don't give a shit. See ya. Bye. You didn't tell me anything useful. I'm sorry. You know, I don't... Check out these piranhas. Oh, you'll get to see them real good in a second. Oh, shit. Guys, I swear they did the PC controls like this on purpose. Yeah.
Jump served. Like a manatee in a boat race.
Get in there. It's right in the oven. Now to find 5,999,999 more. And during the stream, I described this as one of the edgiest games of all time, but in reality, it's very tongue-in-cheek. It's obviously a lot like Postal 2, where you're not meant to be taking any of these events very seriously. Frank sure isn't. All you're doing in this game is taking out the human trash, the scum of our species, and they deserve death, or even worse, at least according to Frank Castle. And so you shouldn't really see these NPCs as people. You are doing a morally righteous act by killing them in the most brutal ways imaginable. Gee, I wonder why Marvel hates the Punisher, a normal guy who uses guns and makes the world a better place permanently, instead of arresting these criminals and then they'll just inevitably break out and kill more people. And so Frank is here to clean up that little problem, which makes him way too edgy for the modern day. Marvel hates this fuck, completely took away his guns, changed his skull logo, he's ruined, all because he represents the white male power fantasy of taking your guns and finally cleaning up our fucked up world. Please, YouTube, don't ban me. I'm not advocating for violence. I'm just saying that's the reason why they hate the Punisher. He is the Giga Chud of comic books. And to get back to the main point of this video, there are also plenty of other superhero games that released around the same time that were great, whether it's the X-Men Legends games or, more famously, Marvel Ultimate Alliance, which were co-op top-down beat-em-ups where you could play as pretty much any of your favorite characters. The cast was surprisingly big. There's the X-Men 2 movie tie-in game where you play as Wolverine, though I've heard that was actually shit. I have fond childhood memories of it, so who knows, could just be nostalgia. Now we get to the HD era, where video games are starting to become mainstream, and as a consequence, a lot of developers felt like they needed to make games much more mature and serious, but luckily this didn't quite affect superhero games yet. The perfect example of this is Prototype. I love that game. I reviewed it a couple years back, and it is just an Edge Kino masterpiece, man. It's a game that only could have existed in the late 2000s. I mean, just look at the fucking protagonist, dude. It's essentially an off-brand Carnage game. You play as a dude who's been infected with this mysterious virus and can manifest his body into giant weapons, and he fucking eats people. And calling Alex Mercer an anti-hero is certainly stretching the definition of the term. You're essentially a neutral third party trying to figure out what happened to you, how you got infected, while the city is being besieged by this plague that has escaped and turned everyone into zombies or hideous monsters, and the government is trying to contain it. and actually the story was surprisingly pretty decent, but trust me, you're not playing this for the story. Everyone played this game for one reason, and that is the gameplay, and it is fun as fuck. It basically takes everything from Hulk Ultimate Destruction and just moves it one step forward. Everything is smoother, you can do a lot more shit. Like I said, you eat people, that's how you get health back, and it's just cool as fuck, man. I'm telling you, it is the perfect 2000s edgy shit that I love. Is it a perfect game? No, but it is one of my favorite games of all time, no doubt. And to bring up another game that released around the same time, Infamous. Now, I prefer the second game in almost every way, but both of them are great games. You play as Cole McGrath, who's got electric superpowers, and he truly actually is an anti-hero. He's pretty much a narcissist at the beginning of the first game, but you can choose between being good or evil. And yeah, binary good and evil choices were never that complex, but again, it added replayability to the game. You pretty much had to play the game twice, not just so you could see the story changes, but so you could get the different powers. Now, the interesting thing about Infamous's gameplay that makes it different from all the other games I mentioned in this video is that it's essentially a reskin third-person shooter. And normally, I don't like third-person shooters, at least not cover-based third-person shooters, but they handled it in such a good way that it feels natural. Because instead of waiting for your health to regenerate, you could do that, or you could absorb some electricity from a light pole, which fuels your powers back and gives you health back. So the gameplay is constantly active. You're constantly zapping people, throwing electric grenades, rockets. In the second game, you can throw cars, and depending on if you're good or evil, you get ice powers or oily fire powers. And the game is just entertaining all the way through. It's a little bit slower than, say, Spider-Man, and it's a lot slower than Prototype or Hulk, but it has some of the best third-person shooting I've ever played in a game, because the superpowers inherently makes it a lot more interesting. And you can't talk about superhero games from this era without covering the most critically acclaimed ones, that being Batman Arkham Asylum and City. Now, I haven't played these games since they released, but I remember Arkham Asylum fucking blowing my mind when it came out. It was probably the most faithful and most love put into a superhero game that I'd ever seen. I was never the biggest DC fan, but I have to admit, Batman is such a good rogues gallery that I was hooked the entire time. It had that great Metroidvania level design to the whole thing, and I just remember pretty much loving it from beginning to end. Now, City, in many ways, was an upgrade, especially in the combat department, but I was never a big fan of Arkham Combat, and I didn't really like the mini sandbox, so even though a lot of people would say it's the better game and arguably a masterpiece, I don't remember liking it as much, but it was still definitely a great game, had a great story. And to this day, you're still going to hear people talk about these games. I mean, they're pretty much in the Hall of Fame of video gaming at this point. And I've pretty much just scratched the surface here. There's the Darkness games, of which the second one I really liked. It's basically an FPS where you also have these shadowy tentacle guys coming out of your shoulders that can tear people to pieces. It's a really fun game. There's X-Men Origins, which is another candidate for the best movie tie-in game. It was basically a God of War clone, but was really fun, actually. And of course, Crackdown, one of Xbox's old big exclusives. You're a secret agent who gets superpowers. Another personal favorite of mine is Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, the first Spider-Man game I ever played, which was a linear beat-em-up where you played as 4 different versions of Spider-Man from different universes. And believe it or not, it actually inspired the Spider-Verse comics and later the 2 movies that have now released. And it legit had a pretty solid combat system. It took advantage of the larger Marvel universe, having Juggernaut and Deadpool show up. Speaking of which, the Deadpool game exists, though that one was not so great. It was okay. It actually might be slightly underrated. I remember critics hating it at the time for some reason. And there's plenty of other games you could name here. I don't really play fighting games, but people really like those Marvel vs. Capcom games, except for the latest one. But it was around the end of the PS3 era where things started to change for the worse. And this is also not so coincidentally when I noticed the quality of the gaming industry starting to go downhill. It's funny that the first Avengers movie released in 2012, and yet, after its release, very few good superhero games came out anymore. At the beginning of the PS4 generation, we got Infamous Second Son, which was pretty much a downgrade from Infamous 2 in almost every way. It streamlined the gameplay, and you had more powers, but Delsin was not a very likable protagonist, and the story was kind of lame. And ultimately, Infamous died after this. There hasn't been another game since. Arkham Knight came out, which many people think is the best out of the Arkham games. I thought it was a bit of a downgrade in some ways, but I can't deny that in terms of graphic fidelity, it's one of the most beautiful looking games ever made, even to this day. Many people have cited that graphics have only gone downhill since Arkham Knight, with only a few notable exceptions like Red Dead Redemption 2 actually pushing video game graphics forward toward more realism anyway. Me, I don't care so much for realism, it's always about the aesthetic design of the game, you know? I don't want video games to be realistic, but Arkham Knight did strike a nice balance between comic bookiness and photorealism that it just looks so damn good, it really does. And then we didn't get another notable superhero game for 3 more years when we got Insomniac's Spider-Man, which frankly I think is just kind of overrated. Is it a bad game? No. I actually did enjoy the game despite the creeping little hints of wokeness in there, like making Mary Jane a reporter instead of a supermodel, which just makes her a shitty clone of Lois Lane, and you were forced to play as her multiple times in that game, which were just awful padding. And then, of course, shoving Miles Morales in because he was the new popular thing. And oh yes, I've seen the leaks for the ending of Spider-Man 2. No, I'm not going to spoil them in this video. You can do that yourself if you want to see just how bad Insomniac has gotten over the years, which is sad because they used to be one of my favorite developers. They actually have made multiple of my favorite games of all time, including my favorite game of all time. So it's very sad to see them slowly fall apart, much like Naughty Dog did. But it was only a matter of time after they were bought out by Sony. But yeah, Marvel Spider-Man, in terms of like AAA cinematic Sony slop, was probably one of their better games to have come out in the past 10 years. But I don't like movie games, dude. And the gameplay here was a clone of Arkham-style combat, but with a lot more cheat codes, aka ways to just instantly disable an enemy, which I suppose I prefer to Arkham combat, but I'm kind of tired of that system by now. I was never a big fan in the first place. And man, I'm really striking blanks for any other good superhero games that came out last gen. I mean, maybe I'm forgetting 1 or 2 prominent ones, but that was pretty much it, man. And I have to emphasize, this is during the height of the MCU. If Disney wasn't a bunch of greedy fucking bastards trying to have their own game studios and have a million shitty gacha mobile games going at the same time, they could have maybe put out some awesome AAA experience, like an Iron Man game, which is really what everybody wanted, and now finally they're getting around to making one after Iron Man's been dead for years in the movies now. So now we come to the last part of the video, basically the downfall of superhero games. And of course, the biggest blunder, the one that I'm sure all of you knew I was going to talk about, is Marvel's Avengers. We finally got an Avengers game, and it was a fucking co-op looter beat-em-up. Are you fucking kidding me, dude? With all the technology of modern games, they couldn't match something as simple as Spider-Man 2 on the PS2. No, we got a fucking linear mission-based loot game. Designed, of course, to nickel and dime you. Oh, and you may have not seen, but recently it was actually taken off of all storefronts because Square Enix lost the license. They no longer have a deal with Disney to make Marvel games because of this game, of course. And I don't even need to tell you about the horrible fucking story, how they shoved Kamala Khan in your face. She's never gonna be a thing. Obviously a diverse woke move. Putting aside her place on the progressive stack, we don't need to talk about her gender, her race, her religion, any of that. Just the fact that she's a fucking shitty self-insert fangirl character alone makes her horrible. So yeah, Square Enix fucked up what could have easily made billions of dollars, and they only ever released one more game under that Disney deal, being the Guardians of the Galaxy game, which was actually okay, but nobody ever talked about it, really. It was forgotten about a month after it released, if that. and it wasn't quite good enough to make my 5 best games of that year, so given the low standards of modern video games, that tells you how mediocre it was, but it was better than what I expected, because I expected nothing. And the final blunder, the one that hasn't even released yet, because it got delayed a year, and I totally called that it would be a giant piece of shit, Suicide Squad kills the Justice League. I fucking knew a shitty, edgy Suicide Squad game would be shit. And of course, it was another looter game, a co-op looter just like Marvel Avengers. Now, I'm sure it was already in development before the Avengers game came out, but you would think they would have fucking scrapped everything after they saw how big a bomb a fucking Avengers game was, so this game was gonna be twice the bomb, because nobody gives a flying fuck about the Suicide Squad. I don't care how many of you shills try to pretend that James Gunn's version was good, it fucking wasn't. And the premise is just so stupid and ridiculous. I mean, really? Brainiac taking over the Justice League, okay, that's fine. But the Suicide Squad, a bunch of C-listers, half of which don't even have superpowers, are going to kill gods. The Flash could have vaporized them in a nanosecond. Much less than being able to take on Superman. And of course, in the original leak, Wonder Woman is the only one who isn't brainwashed, and she saves the day and kills Superman. So no fucking wonder they delayed that shit a year. That's some of the wokest shit I've heard in a while, man. That is really, really fucking pushing it, dude. Even normies probably would have raged about that shit. So who knows, maybe they'll make the game vaguely playable when it comes out next year, but I wouldn't get my hopes up. So yeah, the downfall of superhero games is basically just a microcosm of the downfall of the gaming industry at large. And when I'd recorded this part, Spider-Man 2 wasn't out yet, and now that it's released, well, this video feels more appropriate than ever. My prediction was correct. Not only is it an incredibly lazy sequel gameplay-wise, playing nearly identical to the original game, but it's also full of a cartoonish amount of woke propaganda that I will cover when the review comes out, but man, that game was just straight up not fun at all. Somewhere along the lines, video game developers forgot that video games are an interactive experience. You're supposed to play them, not watch them. And the thing is, despite my very low attention span, as long as you can keep cutscenes entertaining, I can tolerate them. I would prefer a story be told through the gameplay, much like people keep citing Half-Life 1 as a great example of a game that you're pretty much playing the entire time and the story is told through the environment and the scripted events during gameplay. But no, Sony games don't do that. They force you to watch hours of cutscenes while they moralize to you and teach you lessons that we were all taught during elementary school, and yet they're still lauded as these really deep experiences like revenge is bad or be better. What a fucking great theme for a game. Be better. What the fuck does that even mean? And Spider-Man 2 continues this trend by trying to normalize all of the great social change that has happened in the past decade. Again, I'll go into detail in the next video. But to just stick to the gameplay, it plays far too similar to the previous game. This is not like Arkham Asylum to Arkham City, as some of the shills are claiming. No, it's just a fucking lazy sequel with the same exact gameplay as the last one, actually worse in some ways. And the game is clearly not made with passion, except passion to spread political propaganda, as the developers are, well, I heard a rumor they're 70% women. I'll try to verify that in time for the next review, but for now I just gotta get this video out. But I guess the point of this video is to once again dispel the bullshit that is, oh, it's just nostalgia that you like those games that came out 20 years ago. Well, before I made this video, I hadn't played the original Spider-Man 2, or Hulk Ultimate Destruction, or the Punisher game, and yet I ended up liking all three of those, and I pretty much hate the new Spider-Man game, and I'm over halfway through it at the time of recording this. So yes, older games were better, and as popular as it is to shit on cape shit, as people like to call the films, and maybe those movies were always kind of mediocre, and it was more just the novelty of seeing superheroes on the big screen, that is not true of the video games. Superhero games are absolutely a subgenre that needs to return on a larger scale because they were actually fun. If video game developers are so intent on creating these giant empty sandboxes, can you at least give us some fun mechanics to play around with? picking up cars, running faster than a train, leaping tall buildings in a single bound, that sort of thing. Modern video game developers legitimately don't know how to make fun games. I know it's very easy to blame everything on the publishers and to pretend that the incompetence of the diversity hires has nothing to do with the quality of the games, because I've heard a lot of game directors try and run defense for these shitty diversity hire dev teams by saying that, oh, no developer wants to release a bad game. Yeah, well, what if they have such giant egos and bad taste that they think they are making a good game? The new Spider-Man 2 has a 91 on Metacritic. Trust me, that's going to come up in the video. And so, yeah, I hope you're looking forward to that. It'll probably be the last major game review for a little while, as I need a bit of a break. I'm kind of burnt out on playing all these crappy games. So that's about it. See you next time, guys.